Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. This will be the continuation of Hidden Messages. This will be Part 19, Chapter 19, entitled Aoyama. Aoyama was probably one of the only people in class that wasn't looking forward to their newest assignment. He had gotten the lowest score out of everyone on the first two secretive communication assignments, and he hasn't done much better after that. He knew that the rest of the class was passing him up, but there was nothing he could do about it. His quirk still hurt him, and he just wasn't as good at being a hero as everyone else. The whole time he'd been at UA, he did his best to hide his insecurities. He used all the glitter and sparkles to hide the fact that he knew that he wouldn't be a top hero like his classmates. He still tried as hard as he could to improve his quirk and keep up, but it wasn't working out for him. He had felt a connection to Midoriya because of that. Midoriya was also hurt by his quirk, just like Aoyama, and he also seemed to think that he had to catch up to his classmates, but that wasn't the case at all. And these secretive communication assignments were proving it. Midoriya and Bakugo got the best scores on the first two assignments, and they did well on the riddle assignment, even though they were in the middle of an argument. Midoriya then got another aspect of his quirk and proved that he was incredibly strong, even without his quirk in the joint training exercise. Then somehow after that, he started improving like crazy and developed yet another aspect of his quirk. For this assignment, Aoyama wasn't expecting himself to do so well, but Midoriya was most likely going to surpass everyone again. It was disheartening to see Midoriya so successful while he was not. That was why even though Aoyama considered Midoriya his closest friend, and really his only friend, he didn't try to be Midoriya's closest one at all. He felt more of a connection with Midoriya than anyone else in the class, but that connection was fading fast. Even though he wasn't expecting to succeed, Aoyama still tried to do well, even if that didn't really work out for him. He was taken out fairly quickly. His group of allies had run into another group early on, and before he even realized that he was being attacked, he was removed. He tried his best to tell his allies a clue that he had traded information with Midoriya to get, but he forgot to mention. But the drone had stopped him, warning him that he would get points removed for not following the spirit of the exercise and continuing to speak after being removed. He argued that they weren't clear enough on that, but he didn't get to tell his allies the rest of the clue. Filling out his allies' sheet was easy, and then he found himself in a room filled with couches and chairs, all facing the giant television screens that were everywhere. Monoma was already there, lounging in a chair, watching one of the screens. Knowing how much the Class B boy hated Class A, Aoyama found a different spot to sit, on the other side of the room. He watched his classmates on the screen. The video feed that he was watching switched between where the most action was, so it was constantly changing between showing different people, especially because nothing really was happening yet. The video just showed different people finding objects. Aoyama did find it interesting that a majority of the people it showed were from his class, but he didn't think too much about it. He did notice that Midoriya was taking up a large portion of screen time, but Aoyama wasn't really surprised. He knew that this would happen. He wasn't, however, expecting the showdown between Midoriya and Bakugo and their allies to go as it did. He'd never been sure what to think of their relationship. At first, he'd been convinced that Bakugo was Midoriya's bully, but he was getting more and more confused as time went on. They seemed to oscillate between being enemies to best friends. They got the highest score ever on those first two assignments, and then they argued during the riddle exercise and didn't talk for a while. After the joint training, they became friends again, it seemed, and then at the beginning of this exercise, they had a loud and devastating fight. Aoyama leaned forward as the two groups noticed each other. He was on the edge of his seat as Midoriya signed something to Shinso, and then the fight was on. The fight between Midoriya and Bakugo took up the majority of the screen time, but the other fights that were going on appeared on occasion. As Midoriya pinned Bakugo, holding a knife to his throat, Aoyama couldn't hold back a gasp. Midoriya had managed to pin one of the best fighters in the class, and so quickly, too. He wasn't sure what Midoriya was waiting for, but he found out after only a moment later, as Uraraka got close to him, her gun drawn, pointing at Bakugo's head. Aoyama had thought a bit about who would be next to join him and Monoma in the lounge and how they would get there. He thought it would be one of the less combat-oriented students or someone that wasn't really taking the assignment seriously. Out of everyone in the two classes, he figured that some of the least likely people to be removed were Midoriya's allies. It was no secret that Midoriya would do anything to save his friend, so he figured that Midoriya would keep that up during this assignment. Midoriya stabbing Uraraka in the stomach was not something that Aoyama had ever expected to see. He didn't understand how that had just happened. 1 second it looked as though Midoriya was moments away from removing Bakugo, and the next second Uraraka was removed and Bakugo was released. Aoyama thought for sure that Midoriya was going to come to his senses and remove Bakugo next, but the next person removed was Sue, shot in the head by Shinso of all people. Aoyama knew that his jaw was probably on the floor by this point, but he was so invested in what was happening that he didn't care. He was so shocked to see that all fighting had stopped after that. Ida and Todoroki were caught in Shinso's quirk, and everyone else was just talking. As they discussed their next steps, Aoyama was hit with the realization that these were the people that Midoriya was working with. The only people he was working with. The exercise was more interesting than he thought it would be. Watching Shinso using his quirk made Aoyama feel even more like he didn't belong in the hero course. Shinso was a late addition, replacing Mineta after the summer camp, but even he was closer to becoming hero than Aoyama was. His quirk was so useful, and he was able to use it in so many ways that would be incredibly useful for heroics. There was no doubt that he could do more with his quirk than Aoyama could ever even dream of doing with a naval laser. Aoyama wasn't sure if he should say anything when Uraraka walked into the room. She still seemed upset, but he wasn't sure if he could say anything to help her. Sue followed her in a few minutes later, and they immediately gravitated to each other, sitting together on a couch not too far from Aoyama. He could hear their conversation, but he was trying to watch what was on the screen, so besides getting an idea of what they were talking about, he didn't listen. They were discussing their last moments in the exercise, although neither of them were aware who shot Sue. Tearing his eyes away from Tokiyami, who was pretending he hadn't been the one to take out his ally, Aoyama turned to quickly explain what they had been missing to the two girls. Sue, Shinso was the one that shot you. He knew that you had figured out who had removed Uraraka and wanted to make sure that you wouldn't tell. Aoyama would normally try and put more energy into what he was saying, make his words more sparkly and slip into French, but he was more focused on the exercise right now, and he wanted to be succinct so that he could get back to watching it. He had caught a glimpse of Kaibara being shot out of the corner of his eye, but he forced himself to not watch. He figured that explaining was more important. What? I don't understand. We're his allies. I even put him down as my top ally. Uraraka threw her hands up in confusion. So did I, Ribbit, Sue added. Look. Aoyama motioned to the screen where Midoriya was grabbing an object, hiding it from Todoroki and Ida. As he put the object in the flag bag, the camera had caught a glimpse of all the objects that were already in there. He found most of those before you were removed. I don't think you were ever his allies. Normally, Aoyama would feel a little bad about being so blunt, but he really wanted to go back to watching everything that was happening. But Uraraka started to argue, but she trailed off. The last object that Midoriya had grabbed, it was one that Todoroki was looking for, but he didn't offer it to him, or even let him know that he had it. They weren't really allies, not to Midoriya. That was apparent. Aoyama didn't look up as more people had slowly entered the room. Ojiro and Hagakure came over to join in their group on the couches, while Komori, Kuroro, and Kaibara went and sat with Monoma. Uraraka and Sue didn't greet any of them either. All of them were watching the interaction that was being shown on the screens. Midoriya and a small group met with Tokiyami, Shoji, and Kota. They didn't fight as they expected, but instead worked together. Midoriya even handed over an object that he had hidden away in his bag. It was obvious to everyone that Midoriya was handing over the object reluctantly, but after brutally stabbing Uraraka, it was surprising that he handed it over at all. The screen briefly showed multiple other groups, and then they had the first group of Class B students that arrived at Midoriya's group. The battle grew quickly, with almost every student that was left taking part. The fight was easily the biggest so far, but secretly Aoyama thought the fight between Bakugo and Midoriya was much more interesting. That sentiment didn't last long, though, because very quickly a few people were removed by a grenade. The majority of the people in the room started yelling, trying to figure out who threw it, but the people that witnessed what Midoriya had already done so far in the exercise knew, and they didn't let the green hair out of their sight. Shut up and watch Midoriya if you want to know what's going on, Monoma snapped, yelling loud enough to be heard over the exclamations of the people who had entered later. Aoyama was sad to see that one of the people taken out by the grenade was Sato, his top ally, but he wasn't surprised at this point. Midoriya was really going all out. As the fight went on, it was difficult to watch. The camera switched between people so quickly, showing people getting removed or where the largest attack at the moment was. But it would only stay at each scene for a moment before moving on to interesting actions. Announcements rang out often, culminating in there only being one person left that Midoriya wasn't working with. Aoyama was pretty proud of Ring. He didn't know the boy from Class B very well, but they were allies for this assignment, and Aoyama hoped that they could remain friends. During the prep time, they had got to talking, and Rin, Sutonori, and they all bonded about being from other countries. They had only grouped together by chance, unable to find other allies, but Aoyama was glad for it. He was less happy about it, however, when Midoriya sent Rin through a wall. It was dead silent in the room, even as more people entered. Everyone watched as Rin went through the building, and then the building began to collapse. The camera was quick to show that Rin was fine, but Midoriya had been right where the building fell. There were mixed reactions to a building falling on Midoriya. The whispers that slowly started up after the building fell all echoed the same sentiment. Everyone was both worried for Midoriya and thought that the building falling on him was karma for how he'd been acting. As soon as the screen showed Midoriya was fine, trapped in a triangle of space under Bakugo, the sentiment changed. Everyone was just back to thinking it was karma. It was almost sad, seeing Ida and Todoroki fight so hard to free Midoriya and Bakugo, after seeing Midoriya work so hard to keep secrets from everyone except Bakugo, Shinso, Kirishima, and Kaminari. It was obvious to Aoyama that Midoriya was going to betray Todoroki, and Ida was already going to be removed very soon. No one in the room was surprised when Bakugo exploded himself away the second that they were free, but it was obvious that Todoroki and Ida were not expecting him to be there at all. They looked confused, but it only took a few seconds of Midoriya explaining for them to be pacified. As the exercise got boring again, chatting had started up. "Who is Midoriya working with?" It was hard to tell during that fight. Sato asked. He had been the first one to get back after the fighting had started, so he had witnessed most of it, but he hadn't heard about Midoriya, or anything he did before then. "He said that he was working with me, Sue, Todoroki, and Ida, and Shinso, but after he stabbed me, I have no idea," Uraraka pointed out. She pouted, sitting back in her chair. "Bakugo, Shinso, Kaminari, and Kirishima," Aoyama spoke up, without turning from the screen, not wanting to miss whatever happened next, even if for now the screen was just showing different people walking. "Wait, but I thought they had a huge fight, and Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari were supposed to be working with us." Mina looked confused and a bit insulted that she was left out. "They were working with you, but Midoriya seemed to trust them, so it seems like they're working with him as well," Monoma spoke up, also not looking away from the screen. "The fight was fake, although I'm surprised that any of you believed it in the first place. It was so obvious that they're friends, and they probably have been for ages, although I guess it isn't surprising that Class A didn't notice. You're supposed to be the superior class, but you really are unobservant." Monoma had sneered, but no one was really paying attention to him anymore. As he was talking, Midoriya had found an object, and then a group of students from Class B found him. It didn't look so good for Midoriya, Ida, and Todoroki. Their defenses weren't holding up, and none of their attacks were landing. Aoyama knew that wasn't the case, though. He kept his eyes on Midoriya, even if it was a struggle to follow his every move. Unlike the majority of the people in the room, he wasn't surprised when Midoriya slit Subaraba's throat, but he still let out a gasp anyway, impressed by Midoriya's power and control to be able to do it. The panic on the screen was reflected on many students' faces in the room. It seemed as though people were just now realizing how terrifying Midoriya could be, but the attack didn't end with just a slit throat. Midoriya, Todoroki, and Ida all shot the remaining students, and then only Tetsu remained. They all expected Tetsu to fall quickly after that, even if only Midoriya was currently going against him. Todoroki and Ida would join in soon enough, but instead, without a fight, Tetsu was captured by the black strands that Midoriya had started to call Black Whip. Murmurs of confusion were heard from around the room, but no one had any answers. The confusion turned to excitement as Midoriya talked about ending the exercise. The last fight was sure to be epic, and everyone was looking forward to watching it. Aoyama imagined what would have happened if he hadn't been removed so early, but he couldn't think of any way that he would have ended up in that final fight. Everyone that was left had done some impressive things. Aoyama knew that he could never be able to stand up in a fight against them, so he was a little relieved that he wasn't there. Before they got far, an announcement rang out that many people were yelling about. Aoyama had been expecting it, as had Monoma, but no one else had been in the room when Ida was poisoned. Even Uraraka and Sue hadn't arrived yet. The screen switched between two people. It showed the grin on Midoriya's face for a moment, before switching to the grin on Shinso's face that was mirrored on Bakugo, Kaminari, and Kirishima, before switching back to Midoriya and his group. "Midoriya poisoned him? When did he do that? How could he have done that without anyone knowing?" It was impossible to make out who was yelling what through the chaos, but finally Monoma managed to silence everyone. "Shut up!" the blonde had yelled, and the noise stopped abruptly. "Shinso poisoned Ida earlier, when he and Todoroki were under his quirk. Midoriya was not the one that poisoned it, but he was in on it," Monoma explained as quickly as he could, but by the time they all turned back to see what was going on, the small group of Midoriya, Todoroki, and Tetsu were on the move. Aoyama found it a bit amusing how Tetsu was being dragged along, Black Whip attached to his wrist and ankles, but he didn't say anything about it, not wanting to start a conversation that might bring attention away from what was happening. It didn't take long for the group to reach Study Hall, and the whole room was tense waiting to see what Midoriya's plan was. No one was expecting him to fly up to the top of the building, and there were murmurs of confusion as Midoriya grabbed a few items, being careful to protect one of them before placing them in his bag. The murmurs got louder as Midoriya began to inspect the glass dome, but they were quieted immediately as they watched Midoriya kick it, causing the whole thing to break apart and the statue that was on top of it to fall. Once again they had been reminded of just how terrifying their small green-haired classmate was. He was smiling as he alerted everyone in the training grounds to their position. The screen changed to show the remaining students all turning to head toward the noise. The exercise was about to be over, and secretly, Aoyama was hoping that Midoriya would come out on top. The tension in the room rose the longer that they waited for other students to get there, leaving everyone on edge of their seats by the time that the first group showed up. A few people chuckled, Aoyama included, when Midoriya pulled Tetsu in front of him, using him as a shield to protect him from the rain of bullets that were being fired at them from the girls that had arrived. However, the majority of the people in the room remained tense, even more so as the last of the students had arrived. Just like it had been during the other large fight, the screen changed often, going between all the different battles. It was hard to follow what was happening in each of the fights individually, but they were able to figure out a general idea. Shinso was taken out, then Kodai. Midoriya fought Kendo, and Aoyama felt a little bad for her. Midoriya was a beast during the exercise, and she'd been doing so well. Bakugo was fighting Jiro. Kirishima and Tetsu teamed up to fight Yaoyorozu, who took a moment to take out Kaminari before turning back to fight against them. Todoroki was going after everyone, except Midoriya. It was chaos, but it was exciting. Each student was going at it with everything they had. Bakugo was able to take out Jiro using a move that he had used before during the other huge fight, and then Midoriya took out Kendo using a knife. From the way that he had used that knife so far during the exercise, it was obvious to Aoyama that Midoriya needs to add one to his costume, but he doubted that he would. Midoriya could be terrifying, but he also seemed to want to be more of a kid-friendly hero. Moments later, Kirishima and Tetsu were taken out by surprise by Todoroki, and then they were the only 4 students remaining. Before anyone could really process that, the screens went blank as smoke had filled the area. They could hear the pops from someone shooting a gun, but they couldn't tell who was shooting or if anyone was hit. After a moment, they were able to tell where Midoriya was. The smoke around him reflected the green lightning that he gave off when he activated his quirk. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when suddenly the smoke cleared. Midoriya had his hand raised, having just cleared the smoke with his finger. The attention stayed on him for only a moment. They got to watch as Bakugo took Yaoyorozu out, and then there were only 3 students remaining. Aoyama was on the edge of his seat as Todoroki held a gun to Bakugo's head. There were many people in the room that were cheering Todoroki on, telling him to shoot Bakugo, but he didn't. Instead, he gave Midoriya the chance. Aoyama thought that he knew what would happen, so he gasped as Midoriya had actually held his gun up to point at Katsuki and apologized. When the shot rang out, hitting Todoroki between the eyes, the room exploded. Aoyama looked around the room to see how everyone was reacting, and most people did the same. There were a few people that seemed happy for Midoriya and Bakugo. Shinso, Kaminari, Kirishima, and Tetsu had only walked into the room moments before, but they were all happy for the 2. Everyone else was upset. Uraraka, Sue, and Ida were especially upset. They had been hoping that Todoroki would pull through. A strangled shriek had everyone turning to look at Uraraka. And then once they all saw that she was staring at the screen, they all turned to look as well. Aoyama only managed to catch a glimpse of what she saw, but he immediately understood. Midoriya was on top of Bakugo, kissing him. Everyone knew about Uraraka's crush on Midoriya except for maybe Midoriya. Aoyama prided himself on being the first one to notice, and he called her out on it during their final. He had thought about it for a while that Midoriya had liked her back, but recently it was obvious that wasn't the case. He felt bad for her, but she wasn't reacting well to it at all. She got jealous and possessive, and it drove Midoriya away even more. He knew that watching him kiss someone that she thought hated him must have been difficult and confusing, but she was screaming and crying, making a big deal out of it. Ida and Sue were doing their best to console her, but Aoyama wanted nothing to do with that, so he walked to a different part of the room. Many other people were talking about the kiss. Most people seemed shocked, but there was a small group by the door that was laughing about them finally kissing, and Aoyama found himself gravitating toward them. They didn't really want to hear about how no one was expecting it, about how shocking it was, because it wasn't. Maybe at first, but if they really thought about it, it wasn't shocking at all. There was always something more between the 2 of them. They had secrets and a history that no one else really understood. It just made sense that they would end up together. Aoyama didn't join Shinso, Kirishima, Kaminari, and Tetsu in joking about how Bakugo and Midoriya were finally together, but he did stand near them. He knew that they would be called out soon to meet with the teachers, so he didn't really want to join any conversations. However, once Mina and Sero had walked over to the group, Aoyama was just standing by, and Shinso had walked away from them to stand off alone. Curious about Shinso's quirk use during the exercise, Aoyama decided to walk up to him and start a conversation. He'd never talked to Shinso before outside of class, always thinking that he had nothing in common with him, but he was curious. "Bonjour. I saw that you shined very bright in that assignment." No longer distracted, Aoyama fell back into his usual way of speaking. Shinso looked surprised that someone was talking to him. "You think so?" "Oui, of course. You lasted longer than most, and your quirk use was impressive." Aoyama complimented him, even though that Shinso was turning a bit pink. "That was all due to Midoriya. I was relying on his plans the whole time, and the quirk use was his idea too. Before I started working with him, all I could do was control a couple of people for short bursts of time. Just doing what I did during the sports festival was beyond what I could do normally." Shinso sighed and shook his head. I thought that was my limit. I never expected to be able to do anything like I did today, but that's Midoriya for you. Shinzo huffed. I'm sure he has about 1,000,000 ways that people in our class could improve their quirks to the point that they're unrecognizable, but he only shares with a few people. Oh, do you think he'd be able to share some ideas that he has about my quirk with me? Aoyama kept a shining smile on his face, trying to hide how deep his insecurities were. I didn't last very long in this exercise, and I'm behind most of the class when it comes to quirks. My naval laser is flashy as can be, but it's not very versatile. Shinzo looked him over for a moment. Midoriya accidentally flipped to the page he has on you once when we were training together. I didn't see too many details, but it looked like he had a ton of ideas. I'm sure that he'd be happy to tell you about all of them. Shinzo laughed. When he's done with you, I don't think anyone could say that your quirk isn't versatile. Thank you, mon ami. Aoyama's grin grew a bit brighter. And I saw more than most of the class. You made the decision to remove Sue all on your own, without Midoriya even realizing. You may have been following his lead, but you shone brightly all on your own. Aoyama caught a glimpse of a hint of a smile on Shinzo's face, and their conversation ended there as all the students were led out of the room to join the rest of their classmates and the teachers. Aoyama had walked into the room defeated, but he left with a new determination. He was going to talk to Midoriya, probably after the work studies, but he is going to talk to him and he's going to get help on improving his quirk. If Midoriya can go from breaking his bones to what he did today, and Shinzo went from struggling to control a few people to his performance today, then there's no reason that Aoyama can't improve as well. He's always wanted to stand in the spotlight, so he should take the chance to learn from someone who has naturally been in the spotlight since starting UA. Aoyama knew that he got one of the lowest scores on this assignment, but he didn't care anymore because he had gained a new determination to do well. Being removed so early might have been the best thing to happen to him because it gave him the opportunity to watch his classmates and get a new perspective on Midoriya. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 19 of Hidden Messages. Chapter 20 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.